by the Consortium for IT Software Quality, or CISQ. This is Tracy Berardi. I'm Program Manager of CISQ. Thanks for joining us today. So I'm here with Mr. Barry Snyder. Barry is Enterprise DevOps Product Manager at Fannie Mae. Hi, Barry. So over the course of 2015 to 2017, Fannie Mae IT transformed from a waterfall organization to a lean culture enabled by Agile and DevOps. So Barry's going to discuss this process and how his team uses software measurement analytics and standards from CISQ to justify the investment and track the transition. So Barry's going to be presenting for about 40 to 45 minutes, and then we'll open up to Q&A. Dr. Bill Curtis, who's the Executive Director of CISQ and leads the standards working groups, he'll also be on the line to help address some questions and provide some more perspective. So we'll be eager to take your questions. You can submit those anytime in the questions tab. So Barry, thank you for joining us. I'm going to go ahead and give you presenting access. Let's see.
Thank you, Tracy.
There you go.
Okay, let me bring up. Okay, just to confirm, can you see the screen using software quality standards at scale?
Yes, looks great.
Okay, great. Thank you, Tracy. So my name is Barry Snyder. I'm the DevOps product manager. We treat our DevOps pipeline as a product itself. It is an enterprise platform shared by several hundred different projects across our enterprise, sliced across multiple portfolios. So before I go, hold on. Before I go into detail on this presentation, I want to talk a little bit about Fannie Mae so we kind of are all on the same page. Fannie Mae, we buy loans, bundle them, and sell them to second parties on the mortgage market. And this enables banks to free up their funds tied up in mortgages to be able to give more mortgages. So that really is our primary mission, is to provide liquidity by buying loans, bundling them, and then reselling them. So just to kind of give an idea of the complexity we have here. So we've been around for quite a bit of time. We have a very large and complex technical environment that we deal with. We have right now what we consider 468 applications. This is a full-blown application. And then we have a total of 1,200 software assets. That includes the 468. Because above and beyond the 468 applications are individual components that are standalone or act as a middleman between multiple applications. We have utilities, et cetera. So we have a very large number of software assets that we manage across our enterprise. So this is 9 portfolios, 6 of them are business, 3 corporate. Most of the software development is done in business. But just to give you an example, one of our corporate groups is our Enterprise Data Infrastructure, EDI, and they compose of 30% of our releases into our production environment. So our core technologies, and I say core, is Java, which is about 70% of our applications are built in Java. Microsoft, which is about another 20% of custom built. Then of the TIBCO, we have TIBCO and .NET. So we have, within our technical landscape is about 80, today's applications, 80 to 90% of them are built from open source components. Within our environment, we have 21,000 components total. 18,000 of those are open source elements. So, and the reason for this is, you know, the industry standard is going towards assembly of an application with 10% of it being custom code, 20 to 10%. The rest of it is all standard functions that are encapsulated within open source components. Majority of these application components are from Central Maven, and most of that is Java. So of our applications, 55% are custom and built in-house, and that's the Java, the Microsoft.NET. And then we have 35% are COTS and 10% are software as a service. So we have a very complex environment that is also, we have on-prem servers, we have a internal private cloud, and then we also have an external private cloud using AWS. So it's not a simple environment. This technical environment is what supports our business. Our pre-tax income was $5.4 billion, net income of $4.3 billion. When I talk about Fannie Mae, and I came here in 2012, we are what I really consider kind of we're called a government-sponsored entity, and we're a blending of both government and commercial. So we have some of the bureaucracy that is involved, but we also have some of the drivers from commercial, which is speed and being able to keep up with the market. So I'm going to jump right to what I call the punchline of, what we saw in 2017 compared to 2012. We really achieved that goal of doing more with less with higher quality. Typically what happens a lot of times is that one gives for the other two. So I may move faster and build more with less people, but at a cost of quality. So what we did was really we measured and looked at all these items from a productivity, because we wanted to improve, being able to go faster at lower cost and with keeping our quality or driving it higher. And how we measured these is I'll talk about these to a degree later on, but for our increase in productivity, we used the CISQ automated function point counts and automated enhancement function point counts over time with laid that also with critical findings. Our cost was we used AFP, and AFP is automated enhancement function points. So that's the delta between two different releases. So AFP, automated function points, is the total count of all of our what is the total function points for at any given point in time. AFP, the E stands for enhancements, is the delta, the change between releases, so between measure points actually. And then we also used TQI, and we had 5 other measures, automated measures that are defined by CISQ that we use to measure this. And I'll talk a little bit about this further later on. So really, we began our journey in earnest in 2014, and I say 2017 to 2012. 2012 was when I joined, and this was the life, what I kind of lived early on, but 2014 is when we really began. And where we're at today has been taking some of the lessons learned over the last couple of years and are working on some new initiatives. So what really began us on this journey, the genesis of our change, really was a drive to simplify our bureaucracy, our technology, and how we do our work. This came about because of market growth in the housing industry, our change in competition, because the secondary mortgage market is something that has been talked about by our government officials to open it up to the market as a whole. And then also the housing ecosystem has really gone through a lot of transformation in terms of technology as well as in how financing is done. So all of these drivers drove us to look at and say, we're an oil tanker. We can't pivot quickly. We need to be able to pivot quickly. And I'll talk briefly about what that looked like so you'll understand what pivoting meant for us. But the one thing I will say is while we've achieved a lot, and I talk about this in the previous slide, what our punchline is, we still have a journey to go, and we're only halfway through our transformation. So it's kind of a realization last year was an understanding and acceptance of the fact that it's still a journey, and it undergoes, transformation is continual improvement, is always ongoing. And you'll hear this, I've been hearing this through industry since the 2000s. Transformation doesn't happen overnight, and it doesn't end. It's something you embrace and continuously improve. So when we looked at our strategic initiatives, there was identified a need to shift the culture We wanted to go lean and agile. We wanted a learning organization and acceptance of risk. When I joined Fannie Mae, there was no acceptance for risk. The view was we would identify and address 100% of risk. And then I'm sure everybody on the call is sitting here saying, wow, that's impossible to do. And yes, it was. But it also had an impact on our delivery rates. We wanted to also towards simplification. We wanted to eliminate a lot of toil work we had. And, one of the things I talk about is that it really emphasizes for development, especially, is our governance around open source components. So we had a process that any open source library had to go through this manual inspection process that was touched by, I think it was 4 or 5 different governance groups. We had our EA, we had legal, we had InfoSec, and then the development group. So we had 4 governance groups that had to go through for review. It would take a minimum 5.6 weeks for a minor upgrade for an item that already existed. The average took 3 months to get a library approved. The long term, the rest, 30% extended out to 9 months. So we had developers that would submit requests for new libraries, and by the time it was approved, they were already moving on and doing something different. So that kind of emphasized, the very typical environment. Everything was hands-on. We did a rough calculation. We're talking somewhere around 36,000 man-hours were spent every year performing that. I will say today for 99% of libraries, we've automated, and we've used a couple different tools to automate this. We've actually eliminated it to on-demand 0 hours spent in this manual inspection. And the manual inspection gives us a true insight into what we're doing. So developers can actually go to this download library service, pull in libraries and work on demand, and it's automatically quarantined. So we actually have better governance we ever had before. So this is just an example of the level of toil work that existed across the enterprise. No matter what you did or what you touched upon, there was some level of toil work, significant. So it explains a lot of where we were. So with the lean, we also realized we needed to focus on how we build our software. One of these was DevOps. Another element was focusing on a software supply chain, and I talked about open source components, but also monitoring and measuring. So we needed to be able to say, how are we going to monitor and measure our transformation? And this is where, automated function points came into play. And I will say it was not an easy discussion. We went through all different finances, head counts, a lot of discussions from top down to the director level, even story points, which all of these are not a consistent, easy way. So this is where we actually came up with automated function points to be able to measure. And I will say, when I first heard about the automated function points as an example, I did it back in the 90s and I quit that job. So I've had people talk to me to say, no, I'm not going to do that. But it's all transparent and behind the scenes. Nobody has to do any function point counts, and it's a number that's automatically generated through the tool that we use for performing our productivity measures. When we do a quality scan, it also generates the function points, which is a very nice feature and functionality to have. So before I dive further, this is getting a little bit into the pains that we experience. I talked about tools, which I don't have up here, but it was a lot of toil work. But, that toil work existed across all the efforts. So we only had 10 projects using Agile-like methods, what we called modified waterfall. So it was waterfall with some Agile techniques applied to it. Today, we are true, we have a center of excellence that's been driving Agile practices. We manage coaches across the entire enterprise, and we are at 80% Scrum or SAFe across the enterprise, true Scrum and SAFe techniques. And the maturity levels between a 2 or a 3. We actually have about 25% that are actually pushing the border on 3 going into 4. It literally took 9 to 18 months to release to production. The bigger the app, the longer it took. I built out a SOA service during those days, and it literally took 6 months to get it into production. And we only spent 6 weeks building the solution. So that kind of gives you an idea, and the rest of it was all toil work, really. Today we have projects releasing every month. Actually, we have some projects that are releasing every sprint. They're not a high number, but it is a very challenging proposition, and they're using infrastructure as code, Puppet specifically, to be able to automate the pipeline. And right now we're working on a enterprise scaled solution for that. We have 5 to 6 inspection points back in 2012, and everything had to be 100% inspection. You know, and I always use the example of and what came out of inspections. I had put together a context diagram showing 5 enterprise strategic initiatives that were consuming a single SOA service. And to identify that this SOA service is what we're building and not the other 5 strategic solutions, I put a box in red, and I was told to change that to green. That was a finding. So minutia inspections. Today we're like one working group, one cab inspect, and I've actually heard just yesterday we're actually at 5% inspection. So it's a random polling, or whenever there's a high number of incidents in production, those applications get inspected. 2 to 4 months to provision servers. Today, we're actually minutes to provision dev and test servers, and we have some refinements going on there as well. We're actually at 36 to 40,000 deployments per month, where before we were around 900 to 1,200. And we had no means to quantify quality of code and components. The only thing we had was, did you do a peer review? If you did, what were your findings and what actions did you take? That was how we quantified our code quality. When I first came on board, I was like, yeah, this isn't code quality. Today, we quantify measurable, and what we've been able to do is identify, we're talking about 30 to 48% since measures began in 2014. We have a tool that automatically generates that, actually multiple tools that we look at our code quality. I really think, though, the impact that's visually seen is if you look at the bottom, you know, we have an application heat map. This actually is generated by CAS. On the left-hand side, we call our fall and winter weathers. That was our code quality in around 2014. You come in today, and we're late spring. A year ago, it was actually more all light greens, but you're starting to see some dark greens pop up, which where, you know, our code quality overall is improving. You know, red and dark colors are bad, light greens and greens are good. So definitely we're seeing a progression. Our highest code quality before was the 3.0. Today we're looking at a 3.6. So before I dive in further, I kind of want to touch upon our DevOps and what does that mean to the enterprise. You know, our DevOps is envisioned. We originally started off really with CI. We focused on building out a tooling infrastructure, focused around Jira, Bitbucket. Originally, we were SVN, but switched over to Git 2 years ago, and are transforming, moving everybody to Git because of the functionality to be able to do branch-driven development, not branch-driven. Anyways, I'm having a loss for words there, but we're looking at Git because we can actually do peer reviews within the code. We can actually trunk-driven development. Jenkins was our core tool. When we originally started out, when we started rolling out DevOps, we started with our CI, continuous integration, going from Bitbucket to CI, and then as our Agile started picking up, we went to Jira. Then we realized that, you know, one of our, you know, you get into theory of constraints, one of our pieces that was slowing things down was the testing. So then test automation took off. We had a tool that we had already built out that we were using for deployment. We kept on maturing that one. Today we're going towards urban code, and we're doing some early pilots right now. What we didn't have at that point in time, and you can see there's a proliferation of tools. We have about 31 tools in play. But we also didn't have a release orchestration or deployment automation from end to end, which is what you need for if you want to get into continual delivery. Continual delivery essentially is everything's automated except for the CAB approval process. And then continuous deployment is everything's automated from end to end. So we have also baking in what we call DevOps intelligence. We actually have a data mart that we've built out that gives insight into the data. And I'll talk a little bit about that journey later on because it's very relevant to where we've gotten to today. and also baking in some AI intelligence, machine learning into our DevOps intelligence. And the reason why the AI machine learning comes into play is when you talk about 31 tools, every tool generates an event every time it's touched. So for example, I go in Jira, I move a story or update, that generates an event. Anytime I check in code or check out code or do any type of synchronization in Bitbucket, that generates an event. Every time I do a scan with code quality, whether it's during CI or if I'm doing it on with an architectural tool like with CAST, where I'm scanning structural quality, I'm doing, we have projects that are using it twice a day, and that's generating a plethora of data across it. So there's, you just take into consideration 3 of these tools, how much data is being generated. It's more than any single person can sit there and look at. And this is where we're using machine learning to be able to analyze the data. And this is kind of relevant to where we're going to next. So, I talk about this, and DevOps really is where development meets operations. So, these roles intermingle. You have operations left shifted early on in the life cycle, and development teams. You have operations that are doing development too. So you have infrastructure as code as well. It's more cultural, and this has been one of our biggest challenges. When we first started doing DevOps in 2014, we did get a lot of resistance saying, "Oh, that will never work." Even 2 years later, we had some operations people that were saying, "No, that DevOps doesn't work." But what we've achieved today, I think, speaks for itself. It's not perfect, and we still have a journey ahead of us. But it's really in the Gene Kim's book, Phoenix the Phoenix Project talks about people first. It's really about the people, and then it's about the process, and last it's about the tools. And this is where, my role is really focusing on the DevOps. We have Agile COE that's also focusing on the practices around Agile that are then enabled through the DevOps tools. And my challenge as the product manager is I have 31 tools that are interconnected. We have about 60% are tied together. There's still a lot of connections we need to make across these tools, and this is where our release orchestration comes into play. Just to touch upon, I don't want to reemphasize what DevOps is not. It's not just tools or processes. It's not one tool. We have 31 tools in place. You also, because of how many tools there are, you need an orchestration piece, which is to scale it on an enterprise level. DevOps on individual projects or a small number of projects works very well without orchestration, but when you start scaling across hundreds of applications, you'll get hundreds of snowflakes, each project doing it slightly differently. And with an organization that has governance, that governance needs to be baked in and encapsulated in a way that cannot be changed. Now, I'll use an example is Equifax. So we know about open source and what happened with Equifax and the big impact. They actually had a struts library, an old struts library that actually enabled them to get hacked. Well, we have right now, 2 years ago, we started down a journey of DevSecOps. We had actually baked in a process for, a set of rules that would be run against every application. And what we did was the set of rules were embedded into all the Jenkins jobs. And we have somewhere in the neighborhood of about 15,000 Jenkins jobs. So we just created a script and updated infrastructure as code. Worked out great. But then what we discovered is because we can't lock down Jenkins, individuals started going in and changing those rules. And they started changing when those rules would be launched. So that undermined the whole concept of DevSecOps. And what we realized is we needed something that would give flexibility and adaptability to project teams while having certain areas that are mandatory and required. So everybody has to do the security scans to be able to release into production. But what we've done is given them the ability to modify that. We've been on this journey for 3 years now, since 2014, actually going into 4 years now. And it's not built overnight. We're only about what I would consider about halfway through having a scaled enterprise model. And we're only going from a continuous integration to continuous delivery. So I kind of consider continuous integration as the first step. Second step would be continuous delivery. And then the third step would be continuous deployment, where everything is automated. And it definitely is not a silver bullet. Like any technology, no one technology can solve a solution. This goes back to the aspect of people first, then processes, and then tools. So, did a lot to set the stage for where we're at and how we got there. This is where really code quality came into play at a scaled level. We consider our code quality a core component of our software supply chain. I haven't seen this elsewhere in the industry. I'm sure there's some companies that look at this. Usually when you talk about the software supply chain, you're talking about the components that go into the end-to-end, whether it's commercial components or open source components. You select the best components, and this gets into the lean concepts. Select the best vendors and the best components, and that's what you assemble your software with. And why this is important is, from a software supply chain, is that 80 to 90% of applications today are being built with components. Towards this end, now what we baked into this was, once it crosses from the outside world into Fannie Mae, really what are we doing? We're building components. So it's whether it's an in-house built component, an externally commercial bought component, or a community built component, these are all components that are used to assemble and build our software. So this is actually where we get into the concept of approaching our software development as a software supply chain. So this is one of the ways that we scale. This is, looking at this was how we scale. Now, this is where we applied our code quality, and this is where, over time, we build out what we call our code quality stack, which is a combination of CAST, CenterCube, and Crucible. Also included this is Fortify. Fortify is our security tool. So each of these tools fits a different point in the life cycle of an application, whether you're talking about an application view or an enterprise view. For an application view, everything's, all teams are using Crucible for code reviews, though today that's actually being displaced with Bitbucket, which allows, when you get in trunk-driven development, teams are actually doing all their code reviews within the tool itself. This actually eliminates context switching. So I have to switch from my SVN or IDE directly to Crucible, which was the old practice. And what has come out is, as we roll out Git, teams are now starting to migrate towards just doing all their code reviews in Bitbucket. We have CenterCube, which allows, and we also tie this into the IDE with SonarLint. So as developers do their trunk-driven development, they're running the team's project rules and the security rules against their code. So when they merge into the trunk, they have a golden model, and you have less integration thrashing about and spinning. CenterCube also ties very nicely into Jenkins, though we also have CAST tied into Jenkins. We can launch a CAST job directly from Jenkins. We also use CAST, so most teams actually do a CAST scan, which is where our automated function points are coming from, as well as the CISQ measures. That is performed typically once a week, but we actually have teams that are doing it twice a day. And I'll talk a little bit about how this happens. And then from an enterprise view, our CAST is actually used at the director and above level to look at the overall code quality. Now, one of the interesting data points is, as we watched what was going on with the code quality, we saw teams that were doing practice only, like, for example, peer reviews, are hitting about a 10% code quality. Now, teams that did no type of practice and no tools were at about 8%. So that code review, those peer code reviews, were only achieving a 2% increase in code quality. Teams that were using one tool, such as CAST or CenterCube, in the early days of rolling out our code quality, we saw that a lot. And we did not mandate the use of any given tool. We just said you have to do code quality. And we were seeing about an 18% improvement. Teams that were using two tools, such as CenterCube and CAST together, were hitting about a 24%. So only about a 6% difference. But then when we started getting the 3+ tools and practices, so this is Crucible or Bitbucket, coupled with CenterCube, CAST, as well as agile practices coupled into this, and the DevOps, we're seeing between the 30 to 48%. We actually had a couple teams, one team in particular really shined in my mind, was 70% increase in our code quality. And they were very interesting because they started using our code quality stack in 2014, and I'll talk a little bit about them later on. So, you know, scaling does not occur overnight, and what we needed to do was, it was looking for the early adopters, looking for, nothing was mandated. It was value driven, and the success that we have today is partly because of the executive support we had, but also because we talked to the projects a lot, we engaged them, we understood what their pain points were, and really just, said, try it and, drive the higher quality. And what happened was the value add to the team spoke for itself. Now, one of the things we did have, and I don't have the metrics up here, is we do capture all of our incidents. We have our ITSM process, ServiceNow. We were able to correlate the code quality with incidents in production. The projects that had a higher, there was a correlation between projects that had a higher incident rate in production had a lower code quality score. And those incidents were very specific. I mean, there's incidents that can occur because of, power outages, server issues, et cetera, network issues, but these were software quality issues. So incidents that were categorized as software quality incidents, teams that had a higher code quality score actually had a lower number. This is the correlation. We weren't able to tie cause and effect into that, but we were actually able to look at this and say, yeah, there's a correlation here. So this leads me to, earlier I talked about the measuring transformation, which really is to do enterprise scaling, you need to know transformation can take a while. And it's a cultural shift, it's a technology shift, it's a people shift, and that gets into your skills, people's skills to be able to execute and do new things. Typically in the past, when I've done transformation, it was more anecdotal or watching and observing projects, getting the feedback and going back. But what we learned early on is that you need to measure this. Measuring allows you to identify issues earlier before they occur, so that you can actually get directly involved and make the tweaks and changes that are needed to steer the course early in the process, when we're starting to see results that are going more towards not the direction we want to go in, or actually projects that are improving at a higher rate. We can actually say what's working for them, and then take that and figure out what's going on and apply it across the board. So, the measuring the transformation, go into greater detail with articles published with Dr. Curtis in an IEEE article, and I actually reference that here. This is one of the models we had put together to demonstrate, and there's a couple different ways that we've done this, but this was one of the models we looked at. There was a project that had been using our CAST AIP on a limited basis. I think they were doing a scan like once a month. And they were doing waterfall, and, they were able to drop from a 7.6 to a 7.4. That's number of critical findings per 1,000 lines of code, I believe it is on this model. And they would do the big bang release. After 18 months, they would release. Well, we had actually gotten into our DevOps the ability to spin up servers faster, to do continuous integration. We had some agile practices embedded in this project that they were able to leverage. So they were actually able to build a little bit faster. Their first release, 1.1, did take 4 sprints across 2 months, and that was a learning curve there. Like I said, transformation doesn't occur overnight. We were using CAST and AFP. So we actually used these measures to be able to go and talk to them. Not only did they get a huge quality drive, but we used these measures to go and talk to them and say, hey, what's going on in your project? We noticed that it's taken 4 sprints. By working with them, that's our Agile COE, we started seeing them go towards release 2 was completed in 2 sprints. You'll see an ever increasing amount of productivity. And this is where the automated function points come in. So we had a baseline score from release 1. That might have been, I'm trying to remember this particular project. I think they were about 120 function points, looking at this on the right-hand side. But then as they went forward, they did some small releases, and then they had some bigger releases as they improved their process. And we're actually able to show this through measuring. Over time, they were actually able to reduce their defects per automated function point by 41%. They were actually using the CAS at the end of every sprint. They would do a CAS scan, and then what they would do is they would use that as part of their retrospective, and they would self-correct their programming practices as they went forward. So you would see this increase and an improvement in how they delivered their software. Okay, so today, this is our today is we're in a cycle of continuous improvements, and our efforts still continue today. And what we're seeing is we're kind of seeing a plateauing effect right now. We're still seeing a 10% increase. Obviously, when you start hitting a certain threshold of code quality, you're starting to get more into the trade-offs. You know, early on, as I was showing, the highest score was a 3.0. I think the median was like a 2.4, 2.6, somewhere in that range. Today, we're talking about a 3.0 median with scores as high as 3.6. And when you start getting higher, you're going to trade off, you know, performance for security, or maybe security for performance. But teams are starting to get more clever in how they write their code so they can actually push both up at the same time. But we're finding that is actually at more of the bleeding edge projects versus the projects that are in the midst of this. So what we've done is we're looking at the cumulative average change across all the applications that we're scanning, and I think we have 218 full applications with over 400 components total being scanned across the enterprise. And that's all custom code right there. So this one here is based off 76 Agile, but I went back in applications over 1 year, but I went back and reconfirmed this. This actually meets our overall enterprise model and where we're at today. So what we're seeing is the number, what we saw was the number of tools obscures the visibility in the metrics. Remember earlier I talked about our DevOps pipeline and the need to build out a data mart. We have 31 tools that are in use, and we were measuring only the core tools, you know, Jira, so kind of like the speed of getting a story completed to code, Bitbucket, our CI integration, and our deployment. So we're really only measuring about 5 tools that we're looking into detail. And we found actually by looking at automated function points, we saw productivity dips on certain projects that had hit a plateau effect. When we went and looked in those projects, we saw that it was other tools that were causing performance. So that initiated a very rapid ramp up of building out a data mart that gives us insight to every one of those tools. What we're finding now is that we have so much data, it's too much to look at, and this is where the machine learning comes into play. So anyways, going back to the obscurement is we now have, and this is a lesson learned, we should have done this much earlier. I think there were some pain points that we experienced and found out after the fact that we would have discovered much sooner if we had had a data mart built out early on, looking across all the tools. And remember, I was talking earlier is that DevOps is not just one single platform tool, it's many different tools to achieve different ends. Now, if you have a smaller technology stack compared to, say, ours, it would be a smaller number of tools. We have a lot of tools solely because certain tools have limitations. They don't do TIBCO, they don't do Windows, they don't do on, you know, client, they only do cloud. There's a mixture of tools that we need to be able to meet the different needs of the business portfolios. So anyways, you know, today was, you know, a lesson learned is we should have done the dev mart much earlier. We've also built out because we have this DevOps data mart, we actually have a project dashboards where it's in Tableau where teams can evaluate the impact of transformation. All of this is tied to code quality because we don't want to move faster with lower quality. So this is where we come into the looking at it from a quality perspective. So pretty much every report that we have pulls the different data and is able to look at it from a quality perspective. With machine learning, what we're embarking on right now is being able to analyze these different data points to see what impacts code quality and what does not. Also, and likewise, because these same measures come from the same tool, we're also looking at the automated function points as a productivity measure to be able to say, is this, are we improving productivity with this change or decreasing it? Right now, at this point in time, we're building a real-time dashboard. There's a number of tools, and we're going through evaluation and looking at, we built an internal dashboard, but we're also looking at different tools like Hygia example, but we're finding they don't quite meet our needs for what we want to achieve. So this is my last slide and wrap up, and then we'll open up for some questions here, is our lessons learned. The first lesson really is early gains. So this is an interesting one, is that we got a lot of quick, heavy lift by using some existing tools in place. We have an ingrown house deployment tool that really served, enabled us to do deployment, but because it was built upon rational tools, it had a lot of limitations. As we removed constraints before that, we came to realize that this tool was an impediment and created a lot of toil work. And this is one of the areas which we were looking at, how many deployments are we doing today? We weren't looking at how much effort went into deployment, because what was happening as teams went faster, their productivity went up, that we were able to measure with AFP. But what we found out too was, because these teams became more productive, release management teams were becoming stretched very thin, and we actually just ghosted one that actually worked through the entire Memorial Day weekend, starting Thursday night, the whole way till Monday morning was their entire a 3-day release cycle, and they had all hands on deck working towards the release throughout all the nights. So this is the level of effort it came into. And this is where I actually had said, it would have been nice to be able to look at some of these tools and look at them across the board, because we would have seen some of these items, which also gets into our measures, which I'll talk about in number 2 and 3. So what we're looking at is, if we had, we were looking at these through productivity. If we were able to look at all the tools, we would have been able to identify earlier on where our early heavy big lifts were becoming now an impediment. And older technologies within a DevOps environment will create that. So we're rectifying that matter right now. The other item ties back to our DevOps data mart. So consistent measures. We were early on, we were focused on a few key tools, which we weren't able to see some of the constraints that were being imposed by the other tools. It was beneficial to be able to look early on to say that, for example, our Jenkins was providing X amount of value in terms of rapid deployment. But what we didn't see is we weren't seeing the whole story end to end. And while the consistent measures are important, you need to also look at the transformation of your measures as your practices evolve. And that ties into literally the number 3 item. By not constantly changing up our measures, early on, like the first 2 years, we were looking at a lot of the same measures, introduced a few new ones, but what we weren't seeing was the overall constraints. And we were able to identify that there was constraints there by looking at productivity when it started to level off. And that's where we started saying, oh, wait a minute, what's going on here? Quality was still going up, but the productivity was leveling off. And we thought it was maturation of the teams. But when we started looking at the different tools and started diving into some of the events, that's actually when we realized what happened. A lot of this is customer engagement is where we uncovered some of this, but it would have been ideal if we had actually, and lesson learned is capturing a lot of these measures, building out that data mart early on, and as you bring in a tool, plug it into the data marts, you're actually looking at what's going on at real time versus getting it through customer engagements, which sometimes can take months for word to reach back to you and for you to understand. So there is more lessons learned in the article I referenced earlier. That actually talks to a lot of specifics of how we did code quality. Limited in word length, but this here in this presentation, I wanted to cover some of the topics and items we weren't able to do so. So I want to, at this point, that's all I have to talk about, and I would like to open this up for questions. I do notice a couple questions popped up. Tracy, what do we do next for, do you want me to just go through the questions?
Yes, I see 4 of them, so plenty, and I have a feeling some more will come in. First question, Barry, quick question. I noticed your percent improvement by health factor. Curious, how do you manage excluding rules/objects in your portfolio? Do you allow them to exclude? Are these scores truly reflective of coding fixes versus masking issues with exclusions? Thanks.
So,
yeah,
Rich, it's a very interesting question and one that we've struggled with. So there is, I've heard different approaches done in terms of the code quality. We have tried to avoid mandate and have really focused on the carrot. So it's interesting is when you look at CenterCube, and I see CenterCube as an early development. So CenterCube fits the role of a project team that has specific coding practices that they want to enforce. And that's really where we see the CenterCube coming into play. CAST itself has some pretty stable rules. Now, the feedback we've gotten on the CAST is that it's not current. I think it takes a year or 2 to get certain rules uploaded. And one of the drawbacks of the tool that we found as well is that updating a rule, you have to roll out across all the other projects, which is a very labor-intensive approach. At this point, as the product manager, I deprioritized that and said, you know what, while they're not the most current, yesterday's practice, they're still within the ballpark of being within a few years. We allow teams, we don't put rules around exclusions, but what we do is we generate reports, and this is included within the tool, but we enhance those reports through our data mart, is teams that are excluding more than what's going on. Now, we've had teams come to us, and we see it as an education. And the one thing we found is about 90% of the projects will do the right thing. They don't do a lot of exclusions. They just exclude rules that are not applicable. When we introduced the code quality service, what we ended up doing was we walked teams through the use of the tools, onboard them onto the tool, then we would run training, and then within one sprint, we would meet with them again and do a retrospective with them, and then we would do a final retrospective with them 2 weeks after that. So, and then we would decouple, and then we had a service desk where they reach out to us. And a lot of this was to educate them on how to go about this. What we found is some projects that are very, have doing some very modern practices are doing about couple hundred exclusions. We only saw, I think, 2 projects that had exclusions in the thousands. And what we ended up doing was escalating that up through the channels to say, hey, you might want to talk to this project. We had one project reach out to us and say, hey, I want to exclude all these. And we said, why? And they're like, well, I don't want these to go to my management and then get dinged. This is the one-time thing I saw. And then, but we said, when we talked to this individual, we explained, but it gives you transparency. And if you don't have that transparency, what will happen in a year, someone's going to come back and say, where did all this technical debt come from? Because if you obscure your findings that are, not false positives, they're true positives, then you're obscuring technical debt. And then when you go and ask for the dollars for that technical debt, you're going to get turned down. So they're going to say, where'd all this technical debt suddenly come from? So it was interesting is that one particular project we had a lot of discussion with and a lot of engagement, but they actually eventually understood and embraced the practice. So it really goes back to the practices, and I talked earlier about cultural changes, not about the tools, but about engagement. And I've heard of organizations that have flat out rules that saying you can't do X, Y, Z. We lead more by the carrot versus the bureaucracy. We wanted to get away from rules and mandates because whenever you put a mandate in place, you're actually also enforcing it, and that takes manpower. And we didn't have that manpower, so we had to find another way. And then today, we're actually finding there are a few projects that try to game it, but actually with CAST itself, it really is a hard tool to game with, and you don't get a lot of benefit. And it becomes very obvious very quickly when you do. Tracy, what's the next question?
Next question, can you please elaborate on the criteria used to select the KPI and on the alignment to the enterprise goals?
That actually is, so the KPI, We actually, I can't say that we've actually gone out and identified KPI. We're right now in the process of implementing OKRs as a way, objective key results, as a way to drive our building out a solution. Our enterprise has, typically what would happen is at the top, our CEO and the management committee would set up goals. We're actually overseen by FHFA. FHFA would say, this is what we need from you. Today, it's actually more driven from the management committee. But when we had a lot of stuff that we need to achieve, like, for example, they wanted insight to all vulnerabilities in our production environment. That drove what metrics that we needed to go through and select. Which actually, in looking at this in hindsight, goes back. I talked about obscuring some of our measures and tools. That's why we measured certain tools, because FHFA, who oversaw Fannie Mae, and drove a lot of what we did, we had to either prove to them that what we're doing is adding value and transformation, or they were saying, hey, we need you to show us this. And then we would go out and look at it. Looking at it in hindsight, I think we should have done double duty on that, not just meeting their needs, but also looking at it from all the tools to go back with greater detail. And it's hindsight's 2020. But definitely a lesson learned. So we didn't use, our criteria used really was dictated to us. Show us this measure that is driving value across the enterprise goals, and then how that lined up was done at the executive level, the C level.
Thanks, Barry. A couple of questions here from our friend Girish Seshagiri at ISHP. CISQ measures are great. Do you also track production defects and releases over time, as well as technical debt? And is there any way to measure reduction in toil, or put another way, joy in work?
I like that, actually. I'm gonna steal that and use that, joy in work. We have, we're not just solely CISQ measures. CISQ measures were just one part of the equation, and it actually just made me realize that I need to highlight in here. I kind of see it as there's a series of measures that we look at. We do use ITSM, idle standards for everything in production. There is also, we have an in-house built risk framework that really kind of gets to our, it's not true technical debt, but technical debt is input into that. So every application has a risk threshold applied to it. That's financially driven, technology driven, business driven. It has all these different elements that feed into it, quality driven, production, usage. That actually is a big factor, and that's one of the items that we use as our selection criteria for the early adopters of our code quality practice. We really focused on early on. I think there were a total of, MHA had dictated that there were 30 applications that they wanted to address, and then on top of that, I think we added another 21. So in our first year, we had onboarded 51 applications. And I think there was a couple that self-selected themselves that wanted to be onboarded, and we had bandwidth, so we onboarded them. That was really our initial driver for what we did. And some of these were, and I talk about this risk threshold because there was a single number that pulled in a number of different factors from all across the enterprise. Investment, that became a factor. What's the investment? There was a dollar per person on, threshold attached to each of the projects. That was actually one of the criteria. I also used projects that were considered a very high cost, were looked at for improvement and becoming more lean. So that actually became one of the areas where we also looked at from a quality perspective. Because if they're going to go faster with less, we didn't want their quality to go down. Not a easy question to answer. So and then measure reduction in toil, or put it another way, joy in work. We actually, that's kind of interesting, is we haven't got into that, but you triggered some ideas in terms of how we could use automated function points for that. To be able to say, because we do a lot of manual measures, we establish a baseline. We're looking at a tool, a value stream management, VSM, via a value stream model, to be able to look at lead times and wait times. That is actually one of the ways we started embarking on that last year. That was another methodology I wish we had adopted earlier on, because that really gets to looking at a lot of toil work, getting rid of lead and wait times, and then also where do you have a lot of busy work? So where can you add value to a given activity? And that actually is going to be fueled from our data mart. So this all kind of ties together. But I do like the joy in work. But I could actually see us aligning that with AFPs to say less toil work, higher productivity. And, you know, as having been an old hat development, a retired developer, so to speak, the one thing I like, I don't like doing the toil work. I don't like having to wait weeks to be able to get a server to submit a ticket only to have it rejected the last day of a 10-day SLA and then have to resubmit it. And we still experience that today. Those are very frustrating for a developer who just wants to write code. And I think these are some of the measures. Early on, we saw the developers as our core customer, not anybody else, the developer. And that's really where we focused, you know, improving the developer experience early on.
Barry, how were you able to get early buy-in from senior management, as I'm assuming that there was a need for investment and additional expense up front?
So this is multi-front. Early on in the day of DevOps, you know, I talked about the slide early on where we showed our strategic initiative. It was one of those perfect storms in the market. You know, Fannie Mae got slammed in the 2000s for a number of different activities, and rightfully so. We wanted to course correct and show, you know, we're an ethical organization that cares about the customer and mortgage market. So we had to change how we were doing things. We also had to become better at software development. So our upper level management realized that we were oil tanker, and for us to get better, we need to invest. So the Simplify project looked at ways, you know, and it was an open organizational initiative where anybody could submit any idea for improving something, and anybody from the lowest level to the highest level could submit ideas. So towards this end, you know, funding was freed up from other initiatives through Simplify that were then able to invest in other initiatives that took longer and more investment to get there. Another element of this too is to show the value. So after 2014, we had what we called a lighthouse project, and now we actually have a lighthouse project for any new initiative or new item that we're doing. We have a lighthouse project that actually measures. So we have a baseline measure, and then we measure after we've implemented a new process or technology to show here's the value delivered. And then we use that to go back to ask for the dollars to say, you know, right now we're doing a release orchestration pipeline, and we're measuring the value add of getting a story from funded idea to working code and production, which is how we look at our pipeline. And then we look at, you know, we have a baseline of how long it takes, 77 days for the average Agile project today. We're shaving off a good portion of that, and we can go back and say, this is the dollar cost, this is the value add. So really it's having a lighthouse project that you have a baseline that you can measure throughout. And this is also where the data mart comes into play.
Excellent, and I think you just addressed one of the other questions that was in the queue. I think we have time for one more. I like this one. How can you tell when teams are gaming the system? Are there certain patterns or trend lines or metric scores that give this away?
Actually, you know, that's a very interesting question. It's the number of exclusions. So what we saw is we were doing constant. So I have a service manager who was driving the delivery of the code quality service, which was practices plus tools, and then skills, which is what we taught. He kept an eye on what was going on, and what we noticed as a trending is most projects that we're doing using the tool very seriously, we're seeing a couple hundred exclusions across the board. Now, as a side note, a good portion of those exclusions were some of those exclusions, or a portion of those exclusions, were because of how we have technology implemented in Fannie Mae does not match industry standard, which is a story for another day. But so we knew that there was an average number. You'll start to see a pattern of the number of exclusions, and then when you see projects suddenly spike in exclusions, like there was 2 projects that were in the thousands, and we're like, okay, this seems kind of fishy. So one of them actually was completely legitimate. We met with them, we talked, say, hey, we noticed a lot of exclusions, we just want to understand what's going on. We approached it as a very open book to understand. The other one became very obvious because they avoided meeting with us. And then we started looking in detail at their exclusions, and we have a very senior developer came in, and he looked at it, and he looked at their code because we had access to it, and said, yeah, there's a lot of items, they're gaming it. Those are the ones that we then, were able to escalate. There was another area, and you actually brought up an interesting story, is that we had our VP, executive VP, come to us and say, listen, I was looking at this code quality score, and they suddenly jumped. Why did they jump? It seems to me that they did some stuff that would, game the system. When we actually went and looked at the project, they actually had, what they had done was they had changed mid-stride through the project. It wasn't a gaming, actually. What it was they switched from a lot of custom code. They dumped a lot of custom code for open source components. And the interesting data point that we found, most open source components actually have a better code quality score than in-house built components. So it was kind of an interesting data point that we took, and this actually further drove using more components. When we went to the executive VP this a couple of years ago, then they actually became more accepting and say, hey, let's use more open source because we can build faster with a higher quality. We also saw some projects, and this is further reinforced because there were projects who did not want to scan third-party code that they didn't write. And projects, and we left this up to the projects to decide, but after seeing, we monitored this for about 6 months or so, I think it was, until we made a decision and a recommendation to the team that you're better off to scan everything. Because there were some projects that were excluding third-party because they didn't want it to lower their score. And actually what they ended up doing was having a lower score than with a third party. And then we had teams that were doing both, and they actually found some critical items in the open source that they then just upgraded and were able to improve their score from there. It really isn't about the score itself, and I think this is one of the things that we really focused a lot upon, is it's not about the score, but upon the practice and that you're doing the right thing within your code. And I really kind of want to, I think it's a good point to end on, is because I think it's with a tool like CAST, SonarQube, all these tools will give you scores, and I quote unquote. But what really happens is teams get tied up in the score and lose focus on why they're really doing the code quality, which is to drive better code in your software journey, that software supply chain. And that really needs to be the focus, is asking the question, are you really driving better code quality? Do you really have transparency into your technical debt that you've been identified as code quality, design, or architectural issues? Because you need that transparency coupled with the quality. So I hope that answers the question.
Yes, it does. And we have just a few here, but maybe I can sync up with you, Barry, afterwards, and Dr. Curtis, and we could ship responses to the couple that are in the queue. So I'm cognizant too of your time, and thank you again for joining us today, and for everyone who tuned in. Appreciate your time, and Barry, I hope to see you again soon. Thank you.
My pleasure.
Have a good day.